Hello and thanks for joining another video. I'm Michelle Crawford and today we'll be painting a realistic colored pencil in watercolor. For supplies, I've got my Winsor & Newton Cotman watercolor set, 2 jars of clean water, Beohong cotton watercolor paper, and a few brushes, and of course my painting prompt pencils. If you'd like to follow along with our painting prompts pulled every week from the Muse Jar, don't forget to check out Watercolor for Real Beginners Facebook group. Let's get started. I chose a reference photo from vecteezy.com, which I've linked below in the description, and I've also shown you here the lines I chose to transfer with graphite paper. So I've already got my image ready to go. I've lightened it with an eraser, and now let's get painting. I'm starting with a light wash of yellow ochre, testing that on a scrap piece of paper to make sure it's nice and light, and now I'll start filling in all of the wooden parts of the pencil I see in my reference photo with a light, even wash. During this step, we'll fill in all of these sections and then use a little bit of wet on wet as well as wet on dry technique to add some dimension. I'm using a smaller brush here, about a size 6, so that I can get into some of these detailed areas, but I'm also trying as best I can to only cover each area of the paper once with this light wash so that we're getting a nice even coverage. So continue with that same light wash on the rest of the wooden pieces before we move on to the next step. As I run out of paint on my brush, I'm going back into my palette and also dipping it in a little bit of water. Try not to add too much additional moisture. The key to having a nice even wash is that everything is equally wet. Now that we've got that nice even flat wash, we're going to go ahead and start adding in some dimension. I'm using 100% cotton watercolor paper, so my paper is staying wet here. I've let it dry a little bit, but not completely. And now I'm taking in a little bit more pigmented paint, so less water on my brush. I didn't dip it in my jar afterward. I'm just dropping that on the shadow side of these sections that I just filled in, and you can see that this middle part here is mostly in shadow, so I dropped that across the way, and I'm using a very light touch here with paint on my brush just to add that again to the shadow side. Look at your reference photo. This isn't always the easiest to imagine what these shadows or form shadows would look like, but if you look at your reference photo, there's a darker side and a lighter side of most of the shapes that you see, and so just going in and adding some of that dimension. Once we have the paint down, you can just let it sit and move around. It's going to blend nicely, and then dry your paper completely before moving on to the next step. Now we've completed the wet on wet, I'm going to go in wet on dry here. I'm adding in a little bit of orange into my mixture and then putting a nice somewhat saturated stripe of color on that shadow side. And now I've rinsed off my brush and cleaned it completely and dried it so it's damp, and I'm using a very light pressure here to gently scrub against the paint that I've already put down, which will make a nice soft blend into the already dried paint. And we'll repeat that in all of the same areas where we had put down that darker color before, enhancing the shadow, adding more contrast and more dimension into your painting. Here you're really just trying to use this light touch to move that pigment around and kind of get it to blend out into the color that you've already put down. If you're getting too much paint down while you're doing this, you might need to rinse your brush again and dry it off as you've picked up paint in the process. But just continue doing this in all of the shadow areas. This is the part where the shaving from the pencil curls under a little bit, so it is mostly in shadow, but where it is intersecting with the other sections of this, I'm adding again more dark shadow on that edge because where it curls over you would see less light. And again, you can see this in your reference photo. Shadows and form shadows and cast shadows can be somewhat difficult to imagine where they might be, but this is why we always use a reference photo, so that you've got a perfect example of where are your lights and where are your darks in your image. While the watercolor is still wet, you are still able to make any adjustments as you see fit. Just remember to use a very light touch, and so that you don't agitate any of the dried paint underneath. Now go ahead and dry all of that layer before we move on to our next step. Now I'll add one more light wash of this shadow color just on the section of the pencil shaving here where it's curled around itself. This will really help create the illusion of form. This is the darkest part of this area in my reference photo, and so I want to make sure to have good contrast using that same blending technique with a light pressure on a clean damp brush to blend that out. And now we're starting to really feel like this is curving around itself, getting that nice form shadow. Go ahead and dry everything completely before we start to paint the blue part of the colored pencil. For the blue, I'm mixing a little bit of turquoise with a little bit of cerulean blue, just to try to match what's in my reference photo. And I'll be using a smaller brush here. We'll start by painting the tip of the pencil and the little bits that are stuck still to the shaved wood before painting the body of the pencil. So using my detail brush here, I'm going to start with a light wash. I want this to be very saturated, so we'll build this up with a few layers, but just trying to get the initial shape of this pencil tip down. And I did paint over the brown wood part a little bit. In my reference, you can kind of see some of that shining through, so did that on purpose, but basically want to fill this section in and then going back for a bit more pigmented paint and dropping that in to add some more saturation. You want to refine your shape, of course, but try not to paint over the section that you've already painted. If you want more pigment, I'm just using a very light pressure here with lots of pigment on my brush to just drop in some of that color. Since this is still wet, that paint will continue to move around. And now for the shavings, I'm just looking back and forth my reference photo, painting the areas where I see some of the colored pencil lead stuck to the shavings here. Again, starting with a light wash. Blue is a pretty dark color, so that we will layer this, but our first step is we just want to get a nice even wash across it, and then we can drop in some additional pigment. Remember, with watercolor, you can't always go lighter, but you can always go darker. So starting off light and then evaluating how dark the color is as it's drying is a good way to approach a painting. And I do want to have these be a little bit more saturated. I don't want them to all be the same flat wash though, because that will be a little bit boring. So I'm just going to go ahead and drop in some more pigmented paint on these wet areas and just kind of let the watercolor do its thing, blend, and make for some really interesting textures. And then up top here, we've got the sections of the actual pencil portion that were shaved off. And so we'll fill these in, again, starting with a light wash. We want this to be a bit more of an even wash than the texture we achieved below. So try to keep your washes nice and even here, filling in all these areas before we move on to the pencil itself. If it helps you, feel free to turn your paper. I'm trying to avoid some of the wetter areas so I don't put my hand in there and mess up my painting. But also if you want to get a better angle to be able to hold your brush a little more easily, turning your paper really helps. I do this quite a bit as I'm painting. Okay, now we've completed that section, and I think now we'll move on to the pencil. Make a few refinements here. We'll be ready to go. I'm gonna grab a larger brush for this step. We wanna get, again, a nice flat wash on these. We will add some shading, but with a larger brush, I'm gonna get more coverage at a single time. So I'm using kind of a pointed oval wash brush here. This gives me the ability to get into some of those smaller detail areas, and then I can use the belly of the brush to pull that wash across the whole section so that it's a nice flat wash. We'll start like we did the other sections, light to dark. Just like the wooden part of this pencil, this section is round and it has, you know, some flat edges on it as well. So we want to be able to create some of that texture just by varying the saturation of our wash. So you can see I put down some paint and now I'm going back in with another wash on top of that. Still using really light pressure here. You don't want to move around too much the paint that's underneath. You want that to stay, and this is also giving us the ability to do some wet on wet blending. So we'll fill in the section here, adding a bit more saturation. And then if you think about the way light would hit this pencil and also look at your reference photo, of course we'll have lighter areas and darker areas which help make the form shadows, which make this pencil appear more round in shape. So we'll do that as this dries. We'll let it dry a little bit, not completely, before going back in. And I've given mine a few minutes, and I'm going back in with that same light wash about 2/3 the way up this side of the pencil. We'll have the highlight on the top here, and then the side of the pencil that's facing me will be darker, and of course we'll have the darkest portion underneath. So I'm using my brush here to add an additional pigment, but also thinking about the way that I'm placing down the paint. With horizontal lines, you want the pencil to appear like it's got some perfectly straight lines, and you can also at this stage kind of refine those edges a little bit. And I'll also add in a little bit more darkness now that I've got some other areas that have dried. I want those to be a little bit more saturated on the pencil tip here. We'll let that dry a little bit more before going back in with some more paint and starting to really think about creating those sections. We of course want the form shadow to kind of wrap around, but we also want this pencil to appear to have some flat sides as well. And so I'm just kind of darkening up those sections and creating with my brush strokes a little bit of that horizontal pattern that you would see on the side of the pencil. I also like to keep tissue handy just to blot up any paint. It's a great way to add some highlights back in. And now we'll start working on some of the cast shadows. So we've got a couple different cast shadows in the reference image. You see a really light cast shadow and then a much darker cast shadow much closer to the object. So we're starting with a light cast shadow. Again, like the form shadows, these can be a little bit hard to imagine. So if you have a good reference photo, I always recommend studying your reference. And even though it may not feel like the shape that you found is quite natural, once we get these placed down, you'll see it adds so much to the image. So I'm trying to be very careful here not to disturb any of that wet paint. So painting right up next to it and just filling these in with a light wash. I'm got a little bit of Payne's gray, maybe a little bit of neutral tint, something I had on my palette. I've added a lot of water here to get this really light wash, using my small brush to apply wet on dry. Continuing with the form shadow down here, as I look at my reference, there's dust and grit on the paper from where you had sharpened this pencil. So I've pulled in a little bit of that blue just by touching a little bit with my wet brush. And you'd also see some reflections. And so this is just kind of a fun way to add that in with some fun texture. And now I'm just going to take some of my dark blue and create a few marks here on the paper. And we're going to use some splattering to make this feel a little bit more random. And so I'll just grab a lot of water in my brush with some paint and just tap it. Hold your brush horizontally and tap the handle, and you'll get some nice random splatters. Now, as our pencil continues to dry, we're going to go back in with our smaller brush now and start adding a little bit more of that detail. Again, this is not completely dry yet, so we're still going to get some nice blending happening, but very, very light touch here. You don't want to disturb the paint underneath. You want to make sure that you're adding paint, not taking it away. And I'm just trying to create some of those edges. If you get any hard edges and you want to soften those out, you can still do that while this is continually wet. I'm seeing one of those edges here, so I'm just using a dry damp brush to again blend that out, very similar to how we did on the wooden part of the pencil. You can even use a damp brush to lift out some of the color. I'm using heavier pressure there to do that, and then just lightly moving that pigment around to keep my highlight. I'm noticing that my pencil edge isn't quite straight, so I'm just at this point still able to make some slight refinements with very light pressure here to make that edge a little more clear. And then I grabbed a little bit of my shadow color. This will help create some of the form. So we've got the highlight on the top of this pencil and then the form shadow on the bottom. So that's going to help make this again appear to be more of a round object. And you'll want this to dry completely before moving on to the next step. Now that everything is dry, I'm going to go ahead and add more color and more saturation to parts of this pencil, helping create more of the shape and form with some darker shadow areas. You can see I want to maintain a highlight on the top side of the pencil, and so I'm avoiding that right now, just trying to add a bit more saturation and darkness to the middle and bottom portion. Now this is really starting to look like a pencil. This is a good time to refine any of those hard edges if you'd like. And I'm also going to start to let this dry. I did notice I'm getting a bit of a hard edge here though, where I'm maintaining the highlight and also want to refine the edge on the bottom here. So I'm just going to let it dry a little bit, clean and off my brush, and then since this section's already dry, just want to soften up the blend a little bit. So I'm adding a little bit of clean water to the paper to kind of wet the area but not reactivate the paint. And as that sits there, I'm going to grab a little bit more water on my brush and just try to lift a little bit of the pigment. If I leave this wet while I do this, I'll still be able to blend it out. Now using that damp brush to kind of move the pigment around, again showing that highlight but a little bit softer so it's not so harsh. And of course we'll dry any wet areas before moving on to the next step. So we've got our cast shadows here, but there's even a darker shadow right next to each of the objects. So now I'm going in with a little bit more of that darker pigment on my brush and making these very sharp lines that are going to show kind of the drop shadow underneath these objects, so exactly where the light is being blocked by the object itself. And this is going to add even more dimension to the painting. And it's these steps like this, honestly, when you're trying to paint something realistic looking, and I wouldn't say that this is completely realistic. It, to me, just looks like a watercolor painting, but by adding these form shadows and cast shadows to your artwork is going to make things look much more realistic, pop off the page, and really add that dimension you're looking for. And once I've got those down, I do want to soften them out a little bit so it is a nice dark contrast, but the edge itself will be a little bit soft. So I'm just using, again, clean water on a damp brush and using that light scrubbing motion to just kind of blend out a little bit of that pigment so it looks a lot more realistic. And now's a good time to look around at your painting, compare it to your reference photo, and make any final adjustments. And there you have it, a realistic pencil painted in watercolor. Thanks for watching this video. I hope you follow my channel, and don't forget to check out the Watercolor for Real Beginners Facebook group where we share a painting prompt every week. Happy painting! It's pulled from the Muse jar. Happy painting!